I'll try to be worthy of that introduction. So I made this title what it is, not just because I thought it was funny, but because for the last 12 years of my career, actually starting with a project with Dennis Baldacchi, who's sitting right back there, have been working with earth sciences data and thinking about how we enable the science on that earth sciences data. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because although I could give you a big formal talk and just talk at you, I didn't feel like doing that here at BIDS, okay? So I've got a bunch of random slides talking about some of the things historically, giving you some background about who I am and things like that. But I would love to have a conversation, okay? So if you see something on here and you go, wow, that sounds really weird, what'd she do there? Just ask me questions during the talk, okay? I don't have any expectation that I make it through the slides. I didn't build them for that. They're meant to be conversation starters, so feel free to just interrupt, ask questions anytime during it. So that already got covered. Let's see if this works. There it goes. So just in case you're not familiar with Berkeley Lab, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on Berkeley Lab. We're those buildings just up the hill, not the ones all the way up the hill, which are Lawrence Hall of Science, but the ones in the middle between campus and Lawrence Hall of Science. These are a little bit old numbers, but I didn't pull newer numbers. We're more in the 4,000 people range up there. Lots of people are joint faculty with campus down here. We have a lot of grad students and undergrads that work up at the lab as well as interns, as researchers, in a variety of different positions. And we have a number of major user facilities. They're listed over here. Hopefully you can actually read the text. Sorry, I don't usually use such small text. So the advanced light source is that little dome that you see on the hill. A fun piece of that is that when they first established the lab, this was the dome of the original particle accelerator or cyclotron that Lawrence built up at the lab when we first established the lab. So they managed to keep that when they built the particle accelerator around it. So there's this funny little dome with just its girders underneath it in the middle of that forms the roof still of the particle accelerator. And then we also have a supercomputing facility. We have the 88-inch cyclotron is actually long gone at this point. It is about to become the integrated biology building. We actually, over the last like 8 years, got some funding from some of that American Recovery Act funding to actually clean this up and take all the concrete and give it to other people and rebuild. So actually that one's gone. The Molecular Foundry, that's actually a strong collaboration with campus, looking at nanomaterials, things like that. The Energy Sciences Network is the networking that connects the labs. It also connects us to lots of the universities. Joint Genome Institute, which is about to move into the building, that's where that one was, is looking at genomics and moving toward gene function, things like that. The Center for Electron Microscopy is very high resolution microscopy, so atomic scale and things like that. And the key to all this and why it's interesting is this fact that there's a massive user population internationally that uses our facilities. This isn't just for Department of Energy. Oh, by the way, that's the other thing. We're one of the Department of Energy national labs, which also sort of semi-constrains what we do, but we're a contractor to Department of Energy. We're actually, in effect, another UC campus. We're just not a school as well. But we actually report to UC Regents as well. So one more quick history thing in terms of Berkeley Lab. So this is actually inside under that little dome that I pointed out. This is Lawrence and his team. And the reason why I want to bring this up is the whole reason why Lawrence wanted to build the lab up on the hill was really to enable something that he wasn't any longer able to do in the academic setting here on campus. He'd been doing it so far. He'd been building his particle accelerators, but he was reaching a scale where it wasn't feasible to put it on campus, and where he also wanted that all the disciplines that he needed could work together on actually putting together this particle accelerator and have it be their job and have it be part of what they do. And this was back in 1931. It was the first national lab, DOE national lab created. And that's Lawrence right there, I think. And the reason why I bring that up again is because that is one of the hallmarks of who we are, is really thinking about team science and doing team science. And that's some of what I'm going to weave through my talk is how we do that team science and how that, and I bring this up also because data science is so much about team science, right? And so when we think about how we're doing data and how we're enabling science on data, if we don't do it as a team science, we usually fail. And so it's something I really emphasize also from the standpoint of data science, because it takes so many different disciplines to really do data science well. Okay, so there's Dennis right there. A couple of years ago. So I bring this project up first. I'm gonna run through really quickly a couple of the projects that I work on within the earth sciences to give you some of the background of the types of projects. So Ameriflux is a carbon flux network. What makes Ameriflux very interesting is not that it has any one site where people are measuring carbon flux. It's that there's, well, actually we know for sure there's at least 350 sites just in the Americas that are measuring carbon flux, and I believe it's closer to 500 sites around the world, or around the Americas. It's around probably about 1,000 sites now around the world where the same measurements are taking place, not necessarily always with the same instruments. There's a protocol and a lot of knowledge about how you measure carbon flux. There's also a lot of different instruments that you can use to do it, and depending on where you are and what type of situation you have and how much money you have and all these other things, that determines actually what instruments you use. But it's actually a pretty broad array of instruments. This is, I don't think this is Dennis's, any of Dennis's, but, and the other thing that I want to bring up is, because later we're going to talk about that data is not always very clean. And these little spikes kind of tell you about one of the reasons why earth science data is often not clean. And we've all seen these on buildings, so what are they for? The attempt, at least. Though I have to say, I sit at the athletics ballpark right underneath a spot where they've got lights that you know, to light up the stadium, and it's got all the spikes there. And there's a dove that builds its nest right in the middle of the spikes every year. So I also know how effective they are. But basically, I mean, this is some of the instruments. I'll have some other pictures of other instruments. Sometimes these are very near the ground, like here. Sometimes these are very high in the air. Part of it's because some of the measurements are from up above the canopy. In this case, the canopy is very low. In this case, the canopy is very high, right? So there's a whole range of different installations also of these things. This is a somewhat older picture of where these towers are. I didn't pull the newer map, but it's representative of the type of distribution. The sparseness here isn't necessarily all because there aren't towers there. It's because they had not, at this point, and even still now, had not reached a point where they wanted to give the data to a centralized group. And we can talk about some of that and why that happens and what we're trying to do to counteract that. Another project that I work with is called NG Tropics. I didn't try to show you the Ameriflux team because it's so big that I actually don't think I have a picture that would actually do it justice. This happens to be most of the NG Tropics team. And here, this project is inspired by the fact that on the climate model, one of the big problems in the climate models is when you're starting to try and project forward, the further forward you're projecting, the more the uncertainties that you have in the model are going to impact those projections. And so a lot of the work in the last, I don't know, 8 to 10 years has really been on thinking about where are those uncertainties and where are the biggest uncertainties and where can we close those gaps. And so one of those is this fact that almost every scientist in North America knows a lot about evergreen needle forests. They know a lot about deciduous broadleaf forests. You know why? Because they're in their backyard, right? But the problem is those models don't work that well in the tropics. And they don't, you know, the model of how a tree grows and how trees replace each other, it's not that accurate in the tropics, right? I mean, the idea that every tree has one trunk, we think that's standard. Not in the tropics, right? I mean, there's fundamental things that we know to be true about every tree that are not true in the tropics. And so this project is really about spending the time in the tropics to try to understand the base properties of what's going on in the tropics. And just to give you a feel for, I mean, this team actually brings together 5 national labs, and I've lost count of how many universities are on this team. So it's actually significantly bigger than this now. And actually, I accidentally cut off a bunch of the picture here even. So it's a very large team working on this. We're working in a broad array of different tropical locations on, you know, understanding that vegetation, understanding the soil dynamics, understanding what happens in the hydrology, understanding what happens when somebody burns part of that forest, things like that. So another one of these projects is referred to as the Watershed Function SFA. I couldn't fit that word in directly, so I sort of threw it into the rest of the title. This one's led by Susan Hubbard, who you might know. She's also connected with campus. And actually, the Ameriflux is led by Margaret Torn, and the NG Tropics is led by Jeff Chambers and Laura Kippers, almost all of which have connections down here on campus. So this one's Susan Hubbard. And here what we're trying to do is understand all about a watershed's dynamics, right? And so normally what's been happening in this space is that the hydrologists all go out there and study the watershed. And they study the hydrology of the watershed. And then there's a group of vegetation people who go out and study the vegetation and what happens with the vegetation. And there's another person who maybe goes out and studies the microbes in the soil and what they're doing. And then there's somebody else who goes off and thinks about the geochemistry and what's happening in the subsurface and you know, in general with the hydrology or the groundwater. What this project is trying to do is bring together the team of people. And again, sorry I didn't show the team, but it's again, it's cross-national labs and cross-universities. But this is really trying to bring together the team of people who can study the whole watershed and start to understand how water travels through the watershed from where it fell to when it comes out the river, to how the microbes affect how things happen in the soils, in the vegetation, all the impacts of all those pieces. What happens when, you know, when the river changes course, what happens with those underground flows of water, all those sorts of things, what's going on in the geochemistry, what's going on with the microbes. Jill Banfield's also involved in this. She's also connected down here on campus. So understanding everything from the traits that are going on within the ecosystem to the transport of the water and a whole simulation of this space. And I think that's, yeah. So that's all the earth science projects I was going to sort of highlight. My role in each of these has been as the data lead. So in all of these, my role is always to help from the data end of going from this beautiful picture to actual integrated data such that people can actually do the work of understanding these things.
What's the hierarchical simulation? I mean, is it one integrated model, or are they separate simulations, or has one?
In this case, it's separate models that are calling each other. So there is a modular interconnect, but it's not at the time step level. So this is at the East River. I've even visited last year. That is the broken wrist from visiting. Yeah, it was snowy. And it was too slippery for us to drive the truck down. Turns out it was too slippery for Deb to walk down, too. But anyway, so yeah, that's the Upper East River. And the reason why the Upper East River was because it was relatively pristine. And it also, it feeds the Colorado River. And so therefore, it also has a huge national importance in terms of understanding the upper watersheds of the flow into the Colorado River. So that's why we picked that one. It also very nicely has several other heads of rivers that have really nice characteristics to study on other attributes of issues going on in this sort of watershed space. How many people remember that thing about the EPA dam bursting and letting a whole bunch of mine slag go into a river? Well, that was one of the other watersheds right next to this one. So it's going to be one of our study sites to look at what happens to those heavy metals. Where do they go? How do we think about what happens in that space? Other questions on that?
So this is the East River in New York City, right?
It is not the East River in New York City. That is not pristine, not even remotely. But I do have to say the other advantage of this one is it is gorgeous up there. It's up above Crested Butte. Up above Crested Butte in Colorado. About a 4-hour drive from Denver, and I happened to do it in September when the leaves were changing, and the aspens are amazing at that time of year. I have these pictures of this bright orange and things, and so I didn't mind so much the wrist thing. Well, I did, but, you know, things happen. Other questions? Actually, I should get Dennis to answer that one. Thanks for coming, Dennis. That's perfect. And there's a lot of other measurements going on at each site to characterize the site and all the activities going on at that site to better understand the changes that are seen in the fluxes. Right? So it's not just the carbon fluxes, but it's also that understanding of the environment that those carbon fluxes were generated from so that you can start to figure out attribution of what's going on. That be a fair? Okay. It's handy that I have somebody I can check my science facts with. Another thing I wanted to mention, and forgot to on the Ameriflux thing that is kind of cool, because one of the questions you should ask at some point, because if you look at, it didn't quite come out of the bio, but if you look at my background as a pure computer science researcher, my background, most of my research had been in distributed systems, and you could ask, how the heck did you end up doing this stuff? You should ask, actually. So I would suggest you do it at some point. A piece of it is that Department of Energy, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that they didn't actually care so much about distributed systems anymore as a research topic. So I had two choices. Leave. We all thought about that. But our other choice was to say, you know what? We like computer science research. It's been a lot of fun. But we really want to impact science in a more visceral way. And so we came up with a strategy, and we pursued it. And right about the same time, Microsoft's eScience program started. And Microsoft came here to campus, and quite a few people pitched them about an eScience project that they wanted to do. And thankfully, Susan Hubbard came to me and said, Deb, what do you think about doing a data one? And I said, great. and Susan is quite compelling when you let her go off on a brand new topic. And she was. And they immediately said, we want to do that. So they came to us and said, look, we want to fund you to do, it was part of the Berkeley Water Center at the time, but it turned out there weren't that many people ready to do a whole watershed problem, and which had been our pitch. And Dennis came along and he said, well, I have a problem. Would you be willing to help us pull together the global data set of carbon flux and maybe like build the whole system to support that? We said, uh-huh. So that was in 2006 about. And so that was the beginning of our journey on the earth science data, and I've never looked back. That was so much fun. And the other thing I will say, and it's not just because Dennis is here, is that what I have found is the earth science community is so much fun to work with. That's the other reason why I've continued on all these projects, because not only is it a really cool problem, it's a really fun community to work with. I don't know, something about people who dig in the dirt, or I don't know. Okay, so this is very similar to a slide I actually put together almost back in 2006. And no, it's not meant to be a likeness of Dennis. But basically what we realized is that every time we went and talked to a group about doing data science in this, in the earth sciences, what you had really was a world where most of the earth scientists were moving from, I've done all my own science. I collect my own data, I analyze my own data, I write my paper. Me and my grad students write my paper. Me and my postdocs and my grad students, you know. And they built up to that point where they, you know, they were still managing to do that, but they were just tipping the edge of going, we can't do that anymore, right? And so, you know, the interesting thing was, what we'd find is they said, well, you guys are amazing computer science researchers. You know all the cool stuff. I think this is literally verbatim out of Dennis. Some version of what he said. He said, can't you build like an integrated portal where we can just, you know, browse the data and do science and not have to worry about it? And we found that almost every scientist we deal with, that's the vision of what we can manage, right? That you can take the things that I used to have to do all this work to create something from, and then write my paper, and you can turn it into some beautiful place where I just go get the fully curated data, and then I just do my analysis and write my paper. And most of my tales are how we get from there to there. It's taken me a variety of different numbers of years to get from here to there on different projects. I think we're accelerating a little bit. But I put together a couple of slides that just try to give you some of the where we started and where we went. And I'm going to leave it to you to ask questions to get the stories about how we got there. So when we joined the Ameriflux efforts, Ameriflux, which is the part of the global carbon flux system that is in the Americas, okay? There was a team that was working as the data team for Ameriflux. They were doing their best to prepare the data, but one of the things that had happened is that Ameriflux has this interesting property. Anyone who's measuring carbon flux has gone out and gotten their own grants to buy the equipment, to staff the site, to create that data. It is not a centralized, great big huge observatory where, you know, there's funding from the center and everybody goes off and does the same things or anything like that. There's some projects now like NEON, there's one in Europe called ICOS, that are more like that. especially back when we started, it was nowhere near like that. And what a typical PI at one of these sites wanted to do is send you whatever they had collected with the first level processing in whatever form they created it into, and then say, okay, you do the rest. And since the center wasn't funding them, you had no lever arm to say, no, 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 you have to do a bunch of work before we'll take it. And so basically, in the early days of Ameriflux, what was going on is basically complete semi-manual translation of all that data into a moderately standardized version of it, manual quality checking, and at that point, an FTP site for where you could get that data. There was no post-processing except for as a campaign, and no standard for the collection of the other data at all, right? Because there's a ton of biological data about even what species is there at this site, what the soil moisture is, all these other things that are going on, what the canopy, what the amount of leaf canopy is, when was the last fire that burned through here, if it's a crop site, what crop is growing, when did they harvest, all these, all this other information that you need to interpret this data. There'd been a desire to collect it, but there was no standard for it, so there was no real way to collect it. So people would randomly send in some sheet with some of this information, but there was no way to bring it together. And there were minimal tools for using this data. So when we came in to try and do the global set, helping to try to move to some of these things, it was very clear, trying to build the global set out of this kind of a picture, it was very clear that more things had to be done. But I will tell you, it's taken us 12 years to get there. So at 12 years, we've got an international data standard of exactly how this data is reported, and exactly what the variable names are, what units they are, all those things. We've now just, in the last 2 years, built a full semi-automated quality checking that this quality checking, as of when we started to, let's say, as of 5 years ago, they were 1 year behind on data submissions. So data would get submitted, it would sit in the queue for 6 months to a year, depending on whether you were friends with the team or not. And at some long time after you'd submitted it, somebody would look at it and say, oh, that's unreadable. Could you submit again? And of course, by then, the grad student who'd prepared it is gone, or the postdoc who'd prepared it is gone. So that was not going particularly well. So this semi-automated system that we just put in place over the last 2 years has changed that to within 24 hours, we get them information about whether the data is formatted correctly, and within a week, you get a quality check of what's going on within your data, right? So now it's within the time frame of still being remembered by the person who submitted it as to what the heck I did when I submitted it, which has completely changed the system. The other thing that's happened is, as of 2013, I was looking up the records for another talk, we had 154 Ameriflux sites. And you can draw your own inferences, but basically, we've had so many sites join in the last 5 years that we are now at 355. Okay? So Ameriflux has been going since 1996, right? That's about the right. I mean, some of the oldest data is around 96 time frame. There's a little bit earlier than that. And so basically, clearly it's working to have changed some of the systems. Some of it is also that it's become cheaper to put these things in, so more people are installing them. But I think that also this taking care of what is the experience for the data contributor, I hope, you've got some of them right back there who can tell you whether or not it's true, really changes the interest in giving us data as well. And so I think if I came and talked to you next year, I'm going to bet we have another 100 sites who've given us data as well. Because joining doesn't necessarily mean they've given us data. The other big thing is that, I mentioned this no post-processing, and you probably went, what the heck is that? So one of the things that happens is the data that we serve up from Ameriflux is the half-hourly aggregation of the fluxes, okay, up from the high-frequency data that the site team puts together. And the problem is what the modeler or a lot of the users actually want is then an actual assessment of what's actually going on, what's going in, what's going out, and that's not quite directly derivable from the flux. And so there's this post-processing that had been developed in Europe by folks at Max Planck, Marcus Reichstein, and Dario Papali at University Tuscia to start to post-process this stuff. And that was only used to build these global data sets. So that's where, if you remember my story says, we came in right about then. And so then to build those global data sets, when we came in, we had to wait for the Europeans to build them. For a whole bunch of reasons, like completely unrunnable code. It needed licenses to even be able to run it that were obscenely expensive, and there was no other reason you would ever buy them because they were for PV Wave. If any of you even have heard of that software. The Max Planck Institute had built so many things in PV Wave, and it just was there. So there was only one group at University Tuscia who could process. Taking even 200 sites globally and processing those took them about a year to get it through because the code was so fragile. It was so difficult to do this processing. So the other thing we now have is we just finished a 3-year project to completely rewrite that code and validate it against the old code. Gilberto Pastorello. Actually, I've got pictures of a lot of the people involved here. There's Dennis, Catherine Van Ingen, whole bunch. There's Margaret Torn, Sebastian. This is the core of the data team through here. There's Dario. I didn't put Marcus on there. I should have. But basically, this data post-processing framework, now we have it, and so it's still slow. So it's right now 4 hours of processing for 1 year of data for one site, but it's all in Python. Which means we can run it like on the supercomputer, and we can just say, we don't care. Just put that site on that computer and come back when it's done, right? So it's going to allow us, even without making it more efficient, to just be able to create a product, right? I mean, that's going to be like game-changing here because what I didn't say is that the number of times this happened was there was a Marconi. They named the sets after where they had the meeting. That was where they figured out what synthesis they were going to do when they got the data set together. So the Marconi set was 30 sites, 90 site years in 2001? 2000. The next data set, which is when we got involved, was in 2007, called the Latwheel Dataset, because Latwheel is this beautiful ski resort in Italy, where they figured was a great place to go off and think about synthesis. That was about 250 sites, I think, about 967 site years. So the Marconi set, it worked perfectly fine to stick it on an FTP site and let the users just download it. The Latwheel set, that's why Dennis came to us. He said, yeah, we don't want an FTP site for this. And so that's why we'd gotten involved. The next data set that came out from that other code was 2015. We expect to put one out in 2019 now that we have this code, right? I mean, so it changes the whole dynamic from once every 7 years to we could actually do this whatever years we want. Yeah?
So thinking about these 100 sites, how
Well, Dennis can answer this better than I, but I'll give a first answer, and if Dennis, if you want to speak up. I think at this point there's been a lot of cross-checking between the different instruments, and so there's pretty reasonable agreement between the different models of the instruments, and pretty good knowledge within the community of what the pluses and minuses of each of the instruments. So generally when somebody's fielding a new site, they start asking questions of some of the other folks who have similar types of sites. So that helps some with the heterogeneity. The other thing that's happened is that besides the post-processing code, Dario Papali's group had written some high-frequency processing code. They GPL'd that code, which is the GNU public license, which makes it viral. And if you don't know what viral means, it means that anybody who then modifies it, they has to make it GPL as well. The really good side of what happened there is Lycor, which is one of the builders of one of the more common instruments there, decided to pick up that code and continue to develop it, including to enable that it could process all the different types of instruments, not just the Lycor instruments. And they've been maintaining that code. And since it was GPL, it's still GPL. And so that's helped a lot with the standardization, because although sites back in the day all wrote their own code, we're seeing more and more that sites are using this, this software that is more standard. So that helps a lot. And I think the other piece, so in terms of our QA/QC, what we try to do, since we're looking at the half-hourly data at that point, it's already been processed for a lot of the instrument corrections and anomalies and things, and it's meant to be sort of already a usable product. And then what we're adding are more of the longitudinal checks that a typical site doesn't really have the software or the time to do, where we're looking across their entire data record for things. We also have code that now looks at what is the expected maximum solar radiation time at any site based on their geographic location. And then is it actually where their radiation sensor says was, you know, so it looks for the time shifts, right? And there's a lot of things like that we've been able to do that have had significant impact on, I think, the quality of the data, because we find things as old as 1996 that you know, had time shifts or other problems, and then work with the site team to get them corrected. So I would say that we're continually improving the quality, especially with this new semi-automated pipeline. There's always more that could be done, and a standardized set has its own issues, because if you had all the same instruments like Neon or like ICOS, you win because they're all the same. You know that it's the same instrument, but the challenge is you're not as agile as Ameriflux, because Ameriflux, you're continually trying the new instruments, you're continually trying new things. I hear that from Dennis a lot as the defense of this, so I think I've are there other things you wanna bring up in terms of why? No? Okay. So it's a philosophy difference. I just presented at ICOS in the Czech Republic a month ago about what we were doing, and the first thing that I got asked is, how do you have any confidence that there's consistent processing? And I said, well, I don't. But we do a lot of quality checking to make sure that at least what we can check is consistent in there. And over time, we're gonna get to more consistent processing. It's a pragmatic choice that we make. The other big thing that we've been doing, and this is still underway, we're still a good at least 2 years from, another question? Yes?
I was wondering about how you track your data with one, how it goes through Flux, and who owns the data?
Those are great questions. I love those questions. Okay. So how do we track the data? That was incredibly hard because, and this goes to a fundamental thing. So this is great because you've just given me the chance to say a lot of the hard things about this problem. And that's it right now today. We really don't have the tools available from CS to enable you to do that. to be able to take, you know, I don't have a plug-and-play sort of system that I can go out there and get that takes in random data from different people where they're continually giving me new versions of it, and we're talking back and forth and getting things corrected, and I'm sending them different plots and things, and then where we go forward and track, because also we have that each site would prefer to give us the data year by year, and we prefer to publish the whole data record for the site, which means that we also have to go through and track which file should we use in building up that final data set, because they might have given us a file more recently that should not be used, or you know, a whole variety of different things can happen. And so it took us about a year to build up the system to do that. So we now have a database where we track every submission. We track, I didn't bring in this presentation a picture. Since I'm a mechanical engineer and the electrical engineering piece of it, we built up a whole state machine. We said, okay, what is the state machine for a file going through this system? You know, because there's certain corrections we're willing to do, and then we check it again and all. You know, there's this whole set of different things that we do to a file, and keeping track of exactly where in the process it was. So we sat down and we drew the state machine of checking the format. We drew the state machine of checking the data quality, and then we built into the database a tracking of each file through the states in the process, through to publishing, and whether that file got retired. So we use that. So we use the database and the state machine to track the files. We just use a file system to hold them. The ICOS folks I know are using a database to hold every ounce of the data. I don't subscribe to that model because it's so easy with one SQL query to kill yourself. And I don't like that mode because recovering from that is so ugly that I don't want to go down that path. So we do that. The other thing we did is we used a ticketing system, you know, a standard trouble ticket system, to actually track for every data submission all the communication we do back and forth with them. So we've actually just repurposed one of these trouble ticket systems and actually built into it that idea that every communication we have with them is tracked as part of the particular report that we sent them, and as its own little trouble ticket. And that's allowed us to keep track of what's going on with each file that comes in. But that was, before we did that, when we did it for FluxNet, it was really crazy. There was one spreadsheet that was the truth. And every site had its own row in there, and there were all these different codes about what had happened so far with that site's data and where it was at and things like that. And it was very error-prone, to say the least. Okay, was there more to your question? Oh, the ownership. That was the other great question. So you're right, because there's all these different sites and groups and PIs. I mean, there's at least a couple hundred independent groups that submit data. Some site, you know, like Dennis's team has, what, 7 towers now? Somewhere close to that. You know, so many of them have multiple towers, but and so it's a huge set of people. What happens in Ameriflux is that once we publish the data, we actually get them a DOI, and the site team decides who are the authors of this data DOI, and they maintain ownership, but they don't maintain separate licensing. Because instead, if you contribute to Ameriflux, you have agreed to the terms of use that we have.
So, interesting that you guys did contribution. I was not sure if that actually or actual file.
So we hold the files that are the final published version and things like that, but the site also keeps their version of the files. I'm trying to think of how that translates to actual ownership. Because in the end, anything we do with those files, we go back and ask the team if it's okay. So at some level, we really treat it as it's still their ownership. And we're the caretakers for now. So maybe in the sense that a library owns the book, we own that data, but only in that sense. But the credit and the other pieces are huge within Ameriflux because these towers are a person's entire career. I mean, some of these have been run for more than 20 years, and it's their career. And so it really matters how you think about the credit, the attribution, and how this data is used, because it's their baby. Okay, so we also built a data services portal. So one other thing I wanted to show, I'd put this together for that ICOS meeting about a month ago, and I really like this because what it's showing is that since we changed over to the new system, we'd also changed completely the output file to make it much more standardized and much easier for users to use. And what you see here is that we're now at a point where we average about 4,700 downloads of data a month. So it's not small. Right now there's a little under 2,000 unique users of the data. So it's pretty high utilization, so that's why we put that kind of work into it. So on NG Tropics, I wanted to point out some of the unique pieces on that. And one of the big things is we were using a lot more pre-existing data that was from people who had no intention originally of giving it to NG Tropics, but had collected it for other reasons, because a lot of the work in the tropics has been under the Smithsonian or under local scientific organizations. This piece is counterintuitive, but we were trying to run models, and so one of the key things that needed to be put together was really the drivers of like meteorological information, things like that, for enabling the models to run. This turned out to be a huge difficulty in the tropics because we had to actually find reliable meteorological data, which is much harder than we ever expected, and a long enough record that it went over La Niñas and El Niños and actually covered a large enough space. We also had this interesting thing of that data ownership was again a big deal, and figuring out what are things that people were willing to do was exciting. What they started out willing to do was email. We got them up to Google Drive. Haven't gotten them that much further than that. You had a question? Yes, we are. Yeah. Right. So we're pretty pragmatic about our approach to cleaning the data and standardizing. This is a huge amount of efforts going on, and we can't really standardize everything. So what we when the El Nino was going on recently, what the team was going to go down there and put in 100 sat flux sensors, and so we asked them. We said, okay, what standard are you using? Well, I don't know, these Grenier sensors. I mean, they're the guy over there at this other university built them. These are very hand-built instruments, and and we said, okay, well, what standard for reporting the data are you using? How are you reporting all the information about how deep into the trunk you did? What was the diameter at breast height? All these things. I said, well, yeah, we do this. And we said, okay, well, can you show us how you do it? And one person showed us theirs, and then the next person showed us theirs, and the next person showed us theirs, and we said, okay, can we all work together to agree to one? And also, as part of that, one of the things we did is we then, so within Department of Energy, there's this real push toward what we call MODEX, which is really starting to make it a cycle between model and experiments where you don't just go off and measure things and then hope that it's useful to the models, and then model things and hope that they can use the instruments. Instead, it's actually looking at where is the uncertainty in the models, then going out and measuring the things you need, and then bringing it back and then figuring out what are the new uncertainty things. Now, which had driven us to SAP Flux. You know, we asked them, why are you going down and getting SAP? Well, the modelers need it. So we said, okay, well, let's get the modelers together with you and ask the modelers what they need about the SAP Flux. And they went through and told us what they needed about the SAP Flux. And one of the key elements, besides a few more minor things, was, oh, and we need canopy height. And the SAP Flux guys are like, what? We said, can you measure it? They said, sure. So suddenly we had canopy height as part of the, part of that standard, which then allowed that the models were able to use the data. Without that round trip, we would have had SAP Flux data and a key missing aspect of what they needed to know to actually use that data. So we did standardize that. We wrote a paper. So Charu Vadarajan and Daniela Christensen, who actually graduated in John Hart's lab here, actually wrote the paper about that, and they've now been standardizing the processing as well for that. In general, we do QA/QC across the data sets, and we do everything we can, but we're very pragmatic about how much QA/QC we can do. So a lot of it is just looking for outliers and anomalous behaviors in the data. We do a mix of things. Primarily what we try to do is go back to the original contributor and get them to look at what's wrong here, and if they are able to give us corrected data. We do that with Ameriflux. We do that in NG Tropics. We found that to be the most effective, because anything we do to change that data would make it not something that contributor would even sign up to that it's theirs. And the flagging I find kind of problematic, because now we're impugning that data as an external source, and so we've tended not to do much on the flagging. We've tended to instead try and push people to change. I know I'm kind of running into the past 5, so I don't want to go too much longer here. So some things similar on the watershed, and a lot of that is this diversity of data. I mean, we really see it in the watershed. And there, one of the big things we've been developing is really a data integration portal that brings all this diverse data into one common framework. And that's been really nice. There's actually a paper in development on that. Charu's been the lead on that, and she'll have that paper out soon, I hope. I'm not going to talk about that one. Kind of gone through that. I mean, here's some of the data QA/QC we see, right? If you're a computer scientist and you're here, you think, oh my God, how the heck did this even happen, right? Because this is what we got from somebody after they'd looked at the data. I thought, how could it be that you looked at this data? This is water level data. Okay, but it actually makes sense in the end. I mean, these were calibration points. They were pulling up the sensor and calibrating and then putting it back down. And oh look, you can see every one of them. But now, as the data team, we had to go back and get them to tell us every calibration point so we could at least get rid of those. And then we had to figure out what was going on with the rest of them. These were kind of fun because when these first happened in the water level data, then one of the people said, well, just take another well nearby, and if it doesn't have that divergence, just fix it. Like, really? You're just going to assume what happened there. So yeah, that's fine. Over the course of about 1.5 years puzzling over this problem, we finally got one of the guys to ask the person who was measuring this exactly how he was doing the calibrations. And it turned out every time he was done with the calibration, he'd just drop it down to the bottom of the well. You know, next time he'd pull it up and he'd drop it down to the bottom of the well. Bottom of the well changes. Or at least what he thought was the bottom of the well changed. You know, so the way we got rid of this problem, at least into the future, is we actually changed the protocol and had a little hook where they hang the sensor from. So it always ends up at the same depth in the well, which meant that we got rid of these divergence. That's the issue tracking. This is actually the portal that Charu has built with the integrated data. It gives you a way to look at it in the, you know, on a map, and then pick particular variables that you want to plot, and you see the plots right there. One of the nice things about this integration portal is that it's actually not assuming it has any of the data. It's actually gathering the data from all the different disparate databases where the data exists and bringing it all together in real time, and then enabling plots and things. Because what we realized is if we did big campaigns of pulling the data from all these sources, then we were always out of date. And so this is this Basin 3D brokering system that now brings together all this data and enables this portal. And that's been a huge development for us. And in fact, she just pointed out that she just managed to add USGS data with like less than a day by just then, you know, adding that to the, so that the underlying broker knew how to pull the USGS, and then so that it then pulled into the portal itself. So this picture doesn't yet have it in it because she just showed it to me yesterday, that in fact that worked. I'm going to skip these things. I guess the point is there's been a lot of, the other nice thing about working in this space is that there's been a lot of nice CS research challenges that come out of looking at this space. Because you start to realize how many places in that data lifecycle there are no tools. There are no ways to resolve this. And one of those is data change. Because in data change, what's happening is that every repository is continually improving their data, right? I already told you I do that in Ameriflux, do it in NG Tropics. Every repository is doing that. And so in fact, when you pulled the data and you did your analysis and you wrote your paper, what data you would get a year from now is completely different, or often quite a bit different, and understanding that and building tools to be able to figure out what's going on, how much impact does that have. Those are some tools we've been building. These are some attempts at how do we show you what those changes look like. This was actually comparing FluxNet 2017 or 2007 and 2015, partially because Dario told us never run the two together. We said, well, we have to know. You know, his answer, as Dennis well knows, was never put the two in the same universe. So we immediately went and did it. And this is just showing the correlation plots between those two sets of data. You start to see how much sometimes it diverges. Another thing that we're doing is now data archive. We're now the data archive for the environmental systems science area within Department of Energy. So if you're funded by Department of Energy on an environmental systems science project, this is now the archive where you put the data. So we've had a lot of fun thinking about attribution, credit, DOIs, all of those things. We've been interacting with all the standards communities. If there's questions, I might have answers. That we just brought up a year ago. And so it's still quite new. Actually, less than a year ago. Yeah, there's a lot of data sharing challenges. And I would say I'm using this picture as the conclusion because I feel like we're just still scratching the surface on a lot of this. We figured out a lot. But there's so much more to do, and there's so many tools that are needed in this space to really handle that data life cycle and tracking the changes and enabling these sort of projects. So with that, I'm gonna end here. Happy to answer more questions.